On August 4th, I posted a video entitled Subsidies and Spin, the Truth About Canada's LNG Hype. And the point was that Natural Resources Minister Tim Hodgson was out hyping LNG expansion in Canada, the West Coast, through the North Coast, Churchill, Manitoba, out on the East Coast. It was panoply of LNG. And I said, look, the hype doesn't match the reality. That was the argument. And I promised that I would come back with the numbers to back it up. So here they are. Now, I sent an email to the minister's department, and I asked the question, what modeling underpins the minister's take on this? And they sent it back a very nice, polite, and useful email that explained the department's position, the government's position, and pointed me to where the International Energy Agency modeling that they're using comes from. And it's the World Energy Outlook 2024. They even gave me a link and the page number. So no problem finding it. I want to talk about that because this is very interesting. And I'll quote from the email to begin. The IEA anticipates global LNG demand to rise by 52%, that'll be between 2023 and 2050, from nearly 400 million tons in 2023 to 605 million tons by 2050. Now, first thing we have to do is the actual graph that they pointed me to is in billion cubic meters. So we need to do some conversion here so we're consistent with the graph I'm about to show you. So 400 million tons is 546 BCM, and 605 million tons equals 830 BCM. Okay, let's get to the graph now here. So this is, as you can see, LNG demand by region and scenario relative to existing and under construction export capacity. And there are three scenarios, as there always are in IEA modeling. And the first one is steps, and that assumes essentially a status quo. The status quo extends from here into up to 2050, and it's the oil and gas industries. The energy future will look much like the energy past. The experts I interview say fat chance. It's just not likely because a lot of the assumptions around the steps, and you see this in OPEC modeling, they spell it out really clearly, is the technology isn't ready, the electric technology isn't ready to displace oil and gas, and governments are tired of subsidizing it, and therefore policy support will decline over time, and that's why you get this bullish estimate. The third one is the net zero, and I don't think that I go out on a limb by saying that nobody these days is expecting that we are going to hit net zero by 2050 to keep us from a 1.5 C rise in temperature by mid-century. It doesn't look like that has any chance whatsoever. So that kind of leaves us with the middle case scenario, APS. So in my opinion, this is the most likely scenario. And one of the reasons is, and this is OPEC disses this scenario by saying announced policies are not enacted policies. And that's true. But if you look through the actual assumptions behind the APS, it's not just about policy. There's a whole raft of assumptions, and many of them have to do with the electrification of the economy, particularly on the demand side. Electric vehicles and transportation, heat pumps and heating and cooling of buildings, and so on. That actually is not only proceeding quickly, it's expanding so rapidly, it's faster than the IEA's forecasts. So that's one of the reasons why I think that the APS is most likely. But now let's look at this chart and see this graph and see what it says about the IEA's assumptions in the three scenarios. So if you look at 2030, what you find is that steps in APS are not very different. And then there's a big gap in 2040 between steps and APS. But the really big one is 2050. APS modeling is about 300 BCM, and of course, steps is 860 BCM. almost three times as much. So the difference between the expectations that the Canadian government is using and in my opinion, the most likely scenario is a gulf. And that raises a huge amount of uncertainty for the government's behind the government's hype. The government cannot say with certainty that there's going to be growing LNG demand out to mid-century. It cannot say that there's enough demand to justify expanding Canada's LNG sector. Now, in fairness to the department, there is some qualification in the email. So let me read it to you. Canada is supportive of industry advancing commercially viable LNG projects that meet Canada's environmental standards. Okay, do you know how many of these projects are? I think there were like 18 that were approved on the West Coast, and Canada LNG has just begun delivering. And I think we've had an FID, final investment decision, on one other one, and there's another one's expected soon. I think that's the scenario. So then they go on to say it has to be supported by provinces, territories, and Indigenous communities. Well, good luck. You might get BC to sign on to more West Coast LNG. Adrian Dix, their energy minister, has already indicated that Indigenous communities is a whole nother thing. And they fought the Coastal Link gas pipeline, and so it's not as easy as it sounds. And then the third point, regulatory approvals remain essential, but the decision to build lies with proponents and investors. So if at the end of the day, with all of this uncertainty, political uncertainty creates risk, why all the hype, given the many, many qualifiers? And this is the point. So I'm going to read some more for you, which is the hypey part of the email. Canada's natural gas reserves, world-class environmental regulations, and I'm going to stop right there because all you have to do is look at the mess that Alberta has with oil and gas environmental liabilities in both the conventional side and the oil sands side, and it's something like in the neighborhood of $300 billion. BC has got its own problems. So it's not world-class, my patootie. And world-class environmental regulations and low-carbon LNG. And that's true. A lot of the production is electrified, and it is fairly low carbon. So we give them credit for that. Present a significant opportunity for Canada to play a leading role in the world's evolving energy mix. I don't think so. Between 2026 and 2028, there's going to be as much as 30 to 40% more LNG capacity come into the market, supply. And the IEA is also forecasting that supply will keep the market served until 2040. That's under the STEPS scenario. If you go to the APS scenario, where demand begins to decline in the early 2030s, nope. There is not nearly enough demand, or there's not nearly enough market, not nearly enough customer interest to justify more investment on Canada's part. And then it goes on to say, Canadian LNG stands to offer allies the opportunity to diversify suppliers, and here's something that's interesting. Displace higher emitting fuels with a stable supply from Canada. There's only one other higher emitting fuel, and that's coal, because gas has about half the emissions of coal. The problem is, so this is an argument that the industry makes, the government makes, the boosters make all the time, that, oh my God, China and other countries that burn coal could displace that with Canadian gas, and look at how much they would bring down their emissions. Nobody ever asks, is that what China wants? Is that what other Asian countries want that are burning coal? No, because they have this huge, those countries import a lot of LNG. They don't have domestic gas for the most part. China does, but its needs are so great that it still has to, it's a huge LNG importer. Last year was 40 or 50 billion dollars and 325 billion dollars for gas, for oil. So you can see where these countries have a big, big incentive to stick with coal, generate electricity, then use electric vehicles and heat pumps and so on, and so that they're using domestically produced energy and domestically manufactured or devices or ones they buy cheap from China. This is one of the biggest canards that the industry and government promote, that somehow there's a great market out there just waiting to displace coal with natural gas. No, nobody in Asia says that. At least I've never heard it, and nor do they say it. They might say it somewhat in Europe, where climate change is a bigger issue, but certainly not in Asia, and that's the big customer. So, and then they finish up this paragraph with, and that would also advance objectives of limiting or ending imports of Russian energy. And the Russians are in our bad books these days, so anything that we could do to hobble Russia would be a good thing. And that's all you have to do is point to the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline announcement, which came out yesterday. It's not a final investment decision, but they moved the ball down the field, and this is like 50 billion 50 BCM. It's a huge part of China's gas. So Russia's going to supply China by gas by pipeline. Won't need as nearly as many LNG imports if that thing gets built. And even if the point here isn't if it will get built or won't get built, it's uncertainty. That's the big issue. We're not the low cost supplier. We're a very small supplier and probably on the upper end of the cost curve. So this idea that somehow Canada's going to become an energy superpower and we're going to supply all of this LNG and it's a big opportunity. No, most likely it's going to be a boondoggle, because if the APS scenario even comes close to being a reality, there just is not going to be enough demand, and there are already going to be way better and way cheaper suppliers in the market. Qatar and the USA would be the two leading ones. Russia would be a third. This is a crowded market with probably limited opportunities, facing a decline in demand beginning in the 2030s. Now, does that sound like it meets the hype that we've heard from Minister Tim Hodgson and from Prime Minister Mark Carney? I would argue it certainly does not.